Tonight, we are going to be talking about the Moors, not just the vague textbook footnote or Shakespearean caricature, but the real Moors, the forgotten architects of European civilization. This isn't just history, this is a story of stolen credit, rewritten legacy, and buried brilliance. What if everything you've been taught about the Renaissance, about Europe's rise from the so-called Dark Ages, was missing its most important chapter? Because when we talk about the Moors, we're talking about a people who didn't just arrive in Europe, they transformed it. They brought science to the West, reintroduced lost philosophies, built empires of thought and architecture, and ruled over parts of Europe for nearly 800 years. Yet today, their legacy has been either erased or twisted into a myth. Before you go to sleep, drop down in the comments and let us know where you are listening from. And of course, make sure you subscribe to get more soothing Black history. If you have any topics you'd like me to explore, let me know in the comments as well. Who were they, really? Where did they come from? And why has their influence been so deliberately forgotten? Let's go back to the beginning, not the Renaissance, not the Crusades, but to 711 AD, when a North African general stood at the edge of Europe with an army, not just of soldiers, but of scholars, engineers, poets, and visionaries. This is the story of the Moors, and how they built the foundation of the modern Western world, only to be wiped from its memory. But before we can understand what they gave the world, we have to understand what the world called them. The word Moor was never meant to be clear. The term Moor is a linguistic shapeshifter, a word that evolved more from imagination and fear than geographic precision. Its root lies in the Latin Maurus, originally used to describe the Berber tribes of Mauritania, a Roman province stretching across parts of modern Algeria and Morocco. But even from the beginning, it was more a vague geographical designation than a precise ethnic term. Over time, the word was absorbed and adapted by the Greeks, becoming Moroi, and later adopted into Old French as Moor, and into English as Moor. By the Middle Ages, it became a blanket term thrown over any non-Christian, dark-skinned person from Africa or the Islamic world. Berbers, Arabs, Sub-Saharan Africans, and even South Asians were often lumped together under this term by European chroniclers who either didn't know the difference or didn't care to. In Spain and Portugal, the Moors were simply called Moros. In France, they were Maures. In English writings, we find not only Moors, but more exoticized forms like blackamoors, often reserved for sub-Saharan Africans. It became a racial term and a religious term. A cultural label. A warning. A slur. This ambiguity gave the term power and danger. It meant you could project anything onto a Moor. In Shakespeare's time, Othello wasn't a specific ethnic figure. He was the other, dark, foreign, unknowable. A man with immense skill and status, but ultimately portrayed as irrational, lust-driven, and doomed. He was not just a man. He was a mirror for Europe's racial anxieties. What's worse is how that ambiguity followed the term into the modern world. In today's US, Moor has been resurrected by Moorish sovereign citizen movements claiming ancient rights based on imagined Moorish ancestry. They base their legal arguments on pseudo-history and fringe interpretations, yet the term still resonates, because it speaks to a lost grandeur, a stolen past, and a longing for identity in a world that erases black excellence. The truth? The Moors weren't a single people. They were a coalition, a spectrum of African and Arab communities whose greatest crime, in the eyes of Europe, was brilliance. The very vagueness of the term was used to flatten a diverse civilization into a threatening silhouette. So next time you hear the word Moor, don't assume you know what it means. Ask instead, who's using it, and what are they trying to erase or reclaim? 711 AD, the conquest that changed everything. Picture this, it's the spring of 711 AD, and a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad stands on the rocky cliffs of what would later be called Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq. Behind him, the Strait of Gibraltar. Ahead of him, the Iberian Peninsula. In between, an empire waiting to be redefined. Tariq wasn't leading a massive, imperial war machine. His forces were fewer than 12,000 men, Berbers, Arabs, and freed African slaves. But they didn't just bring swords. They brought systems. Literacy, engineering, philosophy, military strategy refined by centuries of African and Middle Eastern conflicts. When they crossed the strait and burned their ships behind them, it wasn't just symbolic, it was revolutionary. They came to stay. The Iberian Peninsula at the time was fractured and unstable. The Visigothic kingdom, weakened by internal power struggles and civil war, barely put up a unified resistance. Legend has it that Count Julian, a Christian noble, invited the Moors in to challenge the corrupt King Roderick, setting the stage for an unlikely but permanent occupation. In less than a decade, Tariq and his superior, Musa ibn Nusayr, swept through the peninsula. Toledo, Seville, Zaragoza, and even parts of modern-day France fell under Muslim control. But this wasn't the typical medieval scorched earth conquest. In many cases, cities surrendered peacefully. Muslims offered terms that allowed religious tolerance in exchange for tax. Jews and Christians, often persecuted under the Visigoths, found surprising safety under Moorish rule. Thus began the rise of Al-Andalus, a region that would become a beacon of light in Europe's intellectual dark. Córdoba would soon be home to 70 libraries, while the rest of Europe was lucky to have one per kingdom. Islamic law coexisted with local customs. Christians were allowed to govern their own communities. And knowledge, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Persian, wasn't hoarded. It was taught. And let's be clear, this wasn't a utopia. There were battles. There were hierarchies. But compared to the brutality of feudal Europe or the religious intolerance of later inquisitions, Moorish Spain was remarkably pluralistic. Moorish influence didn't just remain in southern Spain. It radiated north, shaping art, architecture, law, language, and fashion across the continent. Gothic arches? Inspired by Islamic geometry. European medical texts. Based on translations from Arabic scholars. Even the romanticized concept of chivalry borrows from Muslim codes of honor and combat. The conquest of 711 was not just about land, it was about legacy. And while Europe would spend centuries trying to erase that legacy, it began with one bold step onto Iberian soil, and a refusal to retreat. The Renaissance? It had a Moorish spark. The Renaissance didn't begin in Italy. At least, not in the way we're taught. It didn't just burst out of Florence fully formed like a Greek god, it had a spark, and that spark came from the Moors. Here's the truth that doesn't get printed in high school textbooks. While the rest of Europe stumbled through intellectual darkness, the Moors were lighting the way. In cities like Toledo, Seville, Granada, and Cordoba, knowledge didn't just survive, it thrived. They preserved ancient Greek and Roman texts that Europe had forgotten. But they didn't just keep them locked away. They translated them into Arabic, improved them with commentaries, and passed them on. When Europeans eventually discovered this knowledge, they were reading Moorish translations of Greek wisdom, passed through Islamic Spain like a flame from an ancient torch. Take Gerbert of Aurillac, for example. A French monk born around 940 AD. He studied under Moorish scholars in Spain, soaked up Arabic science and math, and brought it back north. He later became Pope Sylvester II, the first French pope, and was so advanced in his knowledge of astronomy and mechanics that people literally thought he had made a pact with the devil. That's how rare scientific literacy was in Europe at the time. Even the numbers we use today, 1 through 9, and the revolutionary concept of zero, were introduced through Moorish scholars who had adopted them from Indian mathematicians. Imagine trying to do calculus with Roman numerals. Good luck with that. Paper, another Moorish contribution, replaced expensive parchment and allowed ideas to travel fast and far. Books became more accessible. Knowledge became democratic. The intellectual elite of Europe made pilgrimages to Al-Andalus, desperate to get their hands on Moorish books and ideas. The architecture of the Renaissance? Influenced by Moorish geometric precision. The rebirth of philosophy? Rooted in texts saved and studied by Moorish minds. Medical breakthroughs? Many were grounded in techniques documented centuries earlier by Islamic physicians. The Renaissance wasn't a miracle. It was a relay race, and the Moors passed the baton. But as Europe woke up and began to find its footing, the source of its inspiration became politically inconvenient. So it began the erasure. The whitewashing. The myth that all of Europe's greatness came from within. The Moors in Royal Europe, not just in Spain. If you think the Moors were confined to southern Spain, think again. Their influence, and in some cases, their bloodline, reached far beyond the borders of Al-Andalus. They didn't just shape Spain, they touched royal courts across Europe. Let's start with Lucius Septimius Severus, a Roman emperor of North African descent who ruled Britain from 193 to 211 AD. Born in modern-day Libya, Severus wasn't some foreign mercenary imported for war. He was part of a powerful Roman family with deep military roots. When he came to Britain, it wasn't just to hold the line, it was to expand it. He rebuilt forts along Hadrian's Wall and launched campaigns against the northern tribes in Scotland. He died in York, but not before earning the title Britannicus for himself and his sons, one of whom would also rule as emperor. Fast forward a few centuries and we meet Queen Philippa of Hainault. She married King Edward III and became one of England's most beloved queens. While the racial identity of Philippa herself has sparked debate, what's not up for debate is her son, Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince. Now, some historians argue that black refers to his armor, but others point to depictions and references to his complexion. Either way, the presence of dark-skinned figures in royal bloodlines wasn't uncommon, it was just inconvenient for later historians to admit. Then there's Alessandro de' Medici, the Duke of Florence in the early 1500s, widely considered the first black head of state in modern Western Europe. The illegitimate son of a Medici and a black servant or possibly a North African noblewoman, Alessandro ruled with full ducal power. His mixed heritage wasn't whispered, it was documented. His reign was short-lived, but his existence alone explodes the myth that Europe's royal elite was homogeneously white. The idea that African ancestry had no place in European nobility is a lie built layer by layer over the centuries. It's not just that Moors lived in Europe, they led, married, ruled, and fought for it. And these weren't isolated cases. Moorish presence is found in medieval English literature, royal court records, and even in the founding of knightly orders. The image of the chivalrous, white European knight. It's a cleaned-up fantasy. Because some of those knights, like Maurian, whom we'll meet shortly, were black. So the next time someone talks about the purity of European royalty, just ask them, whose version of history are they reading? Because from York to Florence, the Moors weren't just guests in Europe's castles, they were at the head of the table. Black Knights, Crusades, and Lost Legends. Forget the fairy tales. The image of the lily-white knight in shining armor? That's a Renaissance remix, a sanitized fantasy. Because buried beneath the myths and tapestries are stories of black knights who fought, ruled, and shaped medieval Europe. Let's talk about Maurian, a 14-year-old black knight written into Arthurian legend. Maurian wasn't just some side character, he was a warrior on a quest. His story begins with a mission to find his estranged father, one of King Arthur's knights. Along the way, he links up with Sir Lancelot, they become companions in battle, and eventually Maurian earns back his father's legacy. The kicker? Maurian is described as having skin black as jet, dressed in armor that shimmered like the night sky. And he wasn't a token, he was valorized. Respected. Feared. But Maurian wasn't alone. European accounts of the Crusades, those long and brutal religious wars, include mentions of African warriors fighting alongside Christian armies. During the Fourth Crusade in 1203, a French knight named Robert de Clary described a mysterious Nubian king who arrived in Constantinople. His skin was black, he had a cross burned into his forehead, and he stayed in a lavish abbey gifted to him by the emperor. That wasn't fiction. That was first-hand testimony. And it wasn't just swords and strategy. Africans contributed to the Crusades through tactical knowledge, navigation, and physical prowess. In medieval England, a skeleton unearthed in Ipswich was identified as belonging to a sub-Saharan African male who likely served as a soldier in the Crusades. He's now known as the Ipswich Man. These stories aren't just exotic footnotes, they're evidence. Evidence that medieval Europe was never as whitewashed as we're told. That African presence in military, religious, and royal circles wasn't rare. It was simply ignored. Race, as we understand it today, wasn't the organizing principle of medieval society. Religion, class, and allegiance held more sway. A Moor wasn't judged by his skin, he was judged by his sword, his mind, or his allegiance. So if you think the idea of a Black Knight sounds like fantasy, the truth is far more fascinating. These weren't outliers. They were legends, just buried ones. But as Europe's religious wars cooled and political lines hardened, another kind of battle was just beginning, the one for memory. From glory to erasure, the fall of the Moors. The fall of the Moors wasn't a single event, it was a long, grinding process of erasure. From the peak of their influence in the 10th century to their final expulsion in the 15th, their presence was slowly, strategically erased from the European consciousness. And it all culminated in 1492. That year, the same year Columbus sailed the ocean blue, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. It was the end of nearly 800 years of Islamic rule. The Alhambra decree followed soon after, forcing Jews and Muslims to convert to Christianity or leave. The Spanish Inquisition? It ramped up to target new Christians suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. But the fallout wasn't just political, it was cultural. Libraries were burned. Mosques were destroyed or converted into churches. Arabic texts were banned. The very idea that Spain had once been led by Muslim scholars and African architects was scrubbed from the record. Those Moors who did convert and remained behind were labeled Moriscos, a diminutive meant to mark them as less than. They were treated with suspicion, forced to wear distinctive clothing, barred from holding public office, and eventually expelled altogether in 1609. It wasn't enough to conquer the Moors, Europe needed to forget them. And they almost did. Because by the 18th and 19th centuries, European historians were already writing about the Moors as though they were myth, strange, exotic invaders with no lasting impact. They became literary tropes, villains in romantic fiction, footnotes in colonial propaganda. The contributions of Moorish scholars to medicine, astronomy, architecture, and art? Buried. The centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims, Jews, and Christians in Al-Andalus. Ignored. The bridges, aqueducts, gardens, and universities they left behind. Claimed by the very countries that erased them. The story of the Moors went from glory to ghost, not through accident, but through agenda. Because it's one thing to rule a people. It's another to erase their memory. And Europe did both. The myth of Europa and the branding of a continent. Before Europe was Europe, it was a myth. Literally. Enter Europa. A Phoenician princess, yes, Phoenician, as in North African and Semitic. According to ancient Greek mythology, Europa was so beautiful that Zeus, king of the gods, transformed himself into a bull just to abduct her. He swam her to Crete, impregnated her, and fathered the future kings of the continent that would eventually bear her name. Europe. That's right. The foundational symbol of Europe is a kidnapped North African woman being abducted by a Greek god disguised as livestock. You can't make this up. Today, Europa's image is plastered all over the European Union, from currency to statues outside Parliament buildings. Her story has been weaponized into a symbol of unity and civilization, ignoring its mythic roots in colonialism and cultural appropriation. But let's go deeper. The name Europa is believed to come from the Semitic root words ereb and op, meaning wide, and face, ors, eye. The Greeks inherited not only the myth, but possibly the very name, from Semitic-speaking peoples, the same people who were trading, sailing, and educating long before Europe found its footing. And then there's the alphabet. The modern European alphabet? It's Phoenician in origin. That's right, your ABCs were brought to you by ancient Africans and Middle Eastern traders. The same people Europe would later colonize and brand as uncivilized. So while Renaissance painters and Enlightenment philosophers were busy imagining Europe as the cradle of civilization, they were standing on the shoulders of empires and cultures they refused to acknowledge. Even the concept of Europe as we know it today is built on myth, migration, and mixture, not purity. But that's not the narrative that stuck. Because when your story starts with a kidnapping, you have to do a lot of rewriting to make it sound noble. Modern misuse, Moors, sovereignty, and identity politics. In the 21st century, the word Moor still lingers, but now it's being used in strange, new ways. In the United States, fringe groups calling themselves Moorish sovereign citizens have claimed that they're descendants of the original Moors who discovered America before Columbus. They argue that they are not subject to U.S. laws, courts, or government authority. These groups often blend elements of black nationalism, Islam, Freemasonry, and conspiracy theories into a New Age ideology that's both historically inspired and wildly speculative. And while many Moorish groups are peaceful, some adherents have made headlines for confrontations with law enforcement or bizarre legal filings insisting that their Moorish nationality exempts them from taxes or arrests. The irony? These modern uses of Moor reveal just how powerful and distorted the label has become. It no longer means a Berber conqueror or Andalusian scholar. It's a symbol now, twisted to fit whatever story someone wants to tell. And it raises the deeper question, why are people reaching for this label in the first place? Because for many Black Americans and Afro-descendant people around the world, the term Moor offers something whitewashed history doesn't: legacy, power, prestige. A narrative that doesn't begin in chains, but in kingdoms, in universities, in gold-stitched robes and libraries filled with stars and algebra. But there's danger in romanticizing the past without understanding it. Just as Europe twisted the story of the Moors to serve empire and conquest, modern misuses risk stripping the word of its rich complexity and turning it into a vague fantasy. The truth is, the Moors weren't perfect. They were conquerors and scholars, poets and generals, religious zealots and tolerant rulers, a multifaceted, messy, deeply human civilization. What they deserve is not mythology, but memory. So whether it's sovereign citizens filing fake documents, or pop culture sprinkling Moorish aesthetics into fashion and film, one thing remains clear: the legacy of the Moors still commands attention. It's just time we gave it the clarity and respect it deserves. History didn't forget the Moors, it erased them. The story of the Moors is not one of mystery, it's one of deliberate amnesia. They were not phantoms who briefly passed through history. They were empire builders, knowledge bearers, and world shapers. They gave Europe its first universities, its scientific method, its algebra, its poetry in Arabic script, and its cultural elegance. And yet, they vanished from the very history they helped write. Why? Because remembering them would mean rewriting the myth of European superiority. It would mean admitting that the so-called cradle of Western civilization was, in many ways, educated by the very people it later colonized, enslaved, and silenced. It would mean confronting the fact that blackness, Islam, and intellectualism have always coexisted, despite centuries of propaganda to the contrary. The Moors were erased not because they were unimportant, but because they were indispensable. Today, traces of their genius remain in architecture, in medicine, in language, and even in the bones of royal bloodlines. But their names, their faces, their stories? Those were scrubbed clean by time and agenda. So let this be a reminder: the Renaissance didn't just come from Florence. The scientific revolution didn't spring from a vacuum. And Europe didn't pull itself out of the Dark Ages alone. There was a spark. And that spark had a name: the Moors. History didn't forget them. It erased them. But now, you remember. And that changes everything. But let's continue talking about Moors in more depth. If you're still awake, I hope you are enjoying this history so far. They ruled Europe while most of Europe couldn't even read. They lit up cities with street lamps while kings in castles were warming their feet over fire pits. They pioneered surgery, algebra, and irrigation systems while Western Europe was bleeding patients with leeches and praying to bones. And they were black. They were Muslim. They were called Moors. But history doesn't want you to remember them that way. In this story, we're going to uncover the buried legacy of one of the greatest forgotten empires in history. We'll explore how black Muslim warriors conquered Spain, brought Europe out of the Dark Ages, and reshaped science, medicine, and architecture. And why the world never gave them the credit. Let's learn more. Origins of the Moors, not just a skin color. Let's clear one thing up: the word Moor isn't a race. It isn't a tribe. It's a label, one that changed meaning depending on who was using it and when. It started as the Latin term Maurus, used by the Romans to refer to people from Mauritania, a region in North Africa. Over centuries, the term evolved. By the time Islamic armies began sweeping across North Africa and into Spain, the word Moor was a catch-all for Muslim people of African or Arab descent. But among Europeans, it quickly became shorthand for anyone with dark skin who wasn't Christian. And many of those Moors were very, very black. Before the Islamic conquests, black soldiers were already making waves in ancient and Middle Eastern militaries. From Nubian archers whose aim was so legendary they were hired across borders, to African warriors like Washi, who fought in battles as early as the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Black men had already proven themselves indispensable on the battlefield. So when Islam spread like wildfire across North Africa, the armies that emerged were already multicultural, and black soldiers were right at the front. But the best was yet to come. How Islam fueled black armies. The early Islamic caliphates were strategic. They weren't just looking for believers, they were building empires. And they knew how to recruit. Freedom was the carrot. Arab commanders promised enslaved Africans freedom if they joined the faith and fought in their armies. For many, it wasn't just conversion, it was opportunity. A new life. A chance to rise in rank. This wasn't token diversity either. These soldiers weren't background players. They were trusted with the most sensitive tasks: palace security, royal protection, and power enforcement. By the 9th century, these black armies weren't just respected, they were feared. Governors in the Islamic world began importing more and more soldiers from deeper within Africa. Sudanese, Nubians, West Africans. They were trained, well-paid, and loyal, because they didn't have tribal or regional allegiances in the territories they were protecting. This made them perfect tools of the empire. In many cities, their sheer presence changed the balance of power. And soon, they would change Europe forever. The conquest of Spain, Tariq ibn Ziyad's army. (711 AD). A date Europe would never forget. That year, a Muslim general named Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with an army of around 7,000 men and stormed into Spain. His army was a mix of Berbers, Arabs, and black Africans, united not by ethnicity, but by mission. They weren't just invaders. They were builders. Within a few decades, much of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control, known as Al-Andalus. And who kept that control tight? Black troops. Trusted as bodyguards, enforcers, and elite military units. One of the first major rulers of Muslim Spain, Abd al-Rahman I, kept a personal army full of black soldiers. And every ruler after him followed suit. But it was the African dynasties that would put their stamp on Spanish soil. The Almoravids and Almohads, Africa's fingerprint on Spain. When people mention the Moors, they often overlook two major dynasties that defined the look, feel, and power of Islamic Spain, the Almoravids and the Almohads. Both dynasties hailed from North and West Africa. The Almoravids brought military discipline and religious reform. The Almohads brought architectural brilliance and scientific progress. And both brought black armies that shocked Europe. Take Yaqub al-Mansur, an Almohad ruler. His mother? A black woman believed to be from Mali or Senegal. His court? Diverse. His soldiers? Heavily African. They weren't just bodyguards. They were enforcers of law and policy across Spain. And unlike local populations, they had no split loyalty, no tribal politics. This is what made them so dangerous and so powerful. They were untouchable, and the world noticed. Science, medicine, and education, Moorish Enlightenment. While most of Europe was stuck in the Dark Ages, Moorish Spain was experiencing a golden age. Córdoba was the jewel. It had 70 libraries, running water, paved streets, even streetlights that burned through the night. While most of Europe's kings couldn't read, the Moors had universities in every major city: Seville, Granada, Malaga, Toledo. They invented surgical tools still used today, developed algebra and advanced astronomy, and they introduced the Arabic numeral system, replacing clunky Roman numerals. While Europe was treating sickness with prayer and superstition, Moorish doctors were conducting surgeries, experimenting with medicine, and categorizing diseases by symptom. Even when the Moors were driven out, European scholars flocked to the remnants of their institutions to study. The Renaissance? It didn't begin in Paris. It began in Córdoba. The fall of the Moors and the rise of Eurasia. The same year Columbus set sail, the Moors were forced out of Spain. The Reconquista was complete. Catholic monarchs took over and began purging every trace of Islamic rule. But it wasn't just a political defeat. It was a cultural erasure. The libraries were burned. The records were rewritten. And the idea that black Muslim rulers once ruled Europe? That was buried. But across the water, in North Africa, the tradition lived on. In the 18th century, Sultan Moulay Ismail of Morocco, the son of an Arab father and a black mother, built the largest army Morocco had ever seen. It was entirely black. 250,000 soldiers loyal only to him. He used this force to demand the disarmament of every other ethnic group in the country. And it worked. The Moors were gone from Spain. But their legacy? It was just getting started. What the Moors really represent. The Moors weren't just warriors. They were visionaries. They didn't just conquer Europe. They civilized it. Their impact on architecture, medicine, education, and governance still echoes today, in buildings, in books, and in systems that trace back to a time when Africa led Europe. But that story made people uncomfortable. and so it got buried. Until now. So next time someone talks about the Dark Ages, remind them, there was light. It came from the Moors. And a lot of that light was black.